start with this. In reference to this weekend's big mega fight, where Canelo Alvarez became a bona fide 4-division unified champion in the super middleweight division, I warned you guys on Twitter that this was going to have an effect on the Ring IQ pound-for-pound list, and it has. By now, many of you who have been following the channel over the years already know how the governing criteria for the Ring IQ pound-for-pound list works. You already know that the list itself uses the fighter's individual accomplishments as a testament to their skills, that those accomplishments are a tangible and measurable method to gauge who belongs where based on what they accomplish, as those accomplishments require a very high level of skill, high level of boxing acumen, and ring IQ. One mustn't forget what a pound-for-pound list is. At its base, it is an assessment of skill. An assessment of skill that takes away a fighter's physical advantages and gauges how good that fighter is regardless of weight. Hence the question, if they were all the same size, who would win? Because, if they were all the same size, then it's not going to come down to size. It's not going to come down to physical advantages. It's going to come down to skill.
That's what a pound-for-pound list is all about.
That, for example, 168 pounds of one guy may be of a higher tier, a higher caliber than, say, 225 pounds, 245 pounds of some other guy. That even though the smaller fighter may be at a physical disadvantage, that smaller fighter still is a better fighter, a higher quality fighter than that bigger fighter.
The one with all the physical advantages.
This past weekend, we saw a very short, a very stumpy Canelo Alvarez take on a mountain of a man in Callum Smith. A fighter that is very statuesque, even for his own weight class, even for the super middleweight division. Canelo Alvarez, he's a 4-division champion, this guy. Champion at 154, a champion at 160, a champion at 175. And currently, he is a full-fledged, unified champion at 168 pounds. In that fight that we saw this past weekend, size didn't matter. Canelo Alvarez's boxing acumen effectively took away Callum Smith's size, his physical advantages, because that's how skilled a fighter Canelo Alvarez is.
That's what a pound-for-pound fighter can do.
Using their skills to overcome the physical advantages that other fighters might have over them, because their skills are more than enough to compensate for the size that they don't have. This past weekend, Canelo Alvarez once again reminded us that in the squared circle, in the sport of boxing, size isn't everything, as skill will have its role to play. He pitched all of a shutout against a much bigger man in Callum Smith, who was an unbeaten fighter before this past Saturday night. That being said, Canelo Alvarez advances to the number 1 spot on the Ring IQ pound-for-pound list.
What happened to Manny?
He hasn't fought in over a year. That's what happened to Manny. Every other fighter currently ranked on the Ring IQ pound-for-pound list has seen action or is going to see action in the last 12 months. Anyone from Chocolatito to Juan Francisco Estrada to Terrence Crawford to Kazuto Ioka, who set lock horns with Kosei Tanaka very soon. Every other fighter on this list has seen some action in the last 12 months, putting their skills to the test, continuing to put their skills to the test, whereas Manny, having been the most accomplished fighter ranked on the list, thereby rising to the top as a result, Manny hasn't fought in over a year, and time, just like these fighters' accomplishments, is measurable.
We know Manny's approaching retirement.
We know that Manny Pacquiao is in the twilight stages of his career. He very recently joined Paradigm Management, and the story seems to be that he may lock horns in a crossover fight with Conor McGregor.
But you know what we don't know?
When is Manny Pacquiao's next fight? Because he hasn't fought in over a year. He hasn't fought in well over 12 months. We're going into 2021 and he still doesn't have a fight booked. What we know is that he hasn't fought in over a year, but what we don't know is when he's going to fight again and who is it going to be against. Every other fighter on this list has seen action, has put their skills to the test. Last 12 months, Manny hasn't. And that is the precedence for him to lose that number 1 spot, that every fighter here is active. In truth, depending on what Manny Pacquiao decides to do next, he may yet be reintegrated into the Ring IQ pound-for-pound list. But here today, on the heels of this weekend's battle between Canelo Alvarez and Callum Smith, Canelo effectively becoming a four-division unified and Ring Magazine champion, in light of Manny's absence, it's only right that Canelo Alvarez occupy that number one spot.
Let's see what the fuck Manny's gonna do next.
You know, with Manny being bumped off that number one spot, Canelo Alvarez moving into it, that creates a vacancy on the list. A vacancy that is now occupied by Scotland's own Josh Taylor, unified Ring Magazine lineal champion Josh Taylor, who currently occupies the number 9 spot in front of Errol Spence Jr. Those of you out there may be looking at this and asking yourselves, well, what was the hierarchy of thought in that? Well, it's very simple. Both Josh Taylor and Errol Spence Jr. are unified champions in their respective weight classes. Both Josh Taylor and Errol Spence Jr. have unseated 2 active reigning world champions. But Josh Taylor, unlike Errol Spence Jr., is the Ring Magazine and lineal champion of his division. Just as well, he won the Muhammad Ali Trophy in the World Boxing Super Series. Those accomplishments and being in possession of the Ring Magazine title, being the lineal champion of his division, as opposed to Errol, who's not, that's enough for Josh to inch to number 9, whereas Errol still occupies that number 10 spot. Josh does have a slightly more credible argument based on the governing criteria that structures the Ring IQ pound-for-pound list, who's ranked where and why. I don't know how you guys have got it on your own lists. I don't know what criteria you're using, what gauges you use to measure the skills of the fighters, because that's what a pound-for-pound list is, after all. It's an assessment of skill. And I don't know how you guys have got it, but that's how I've got it here on the Ring IQ pound-for-pound list, and then those are the current updates. In other news, per tweet from Michael Benson, Canelo was asked about a potential fight with Errol Spence Jr., who was ringside for the fight, but indicated that this is not in his immediate plans. For now, his goal is to unify all the super middleweight titles by beating Billy Joe Saunders and Caleb Plant. Out of those 2 names, if I'm being honest, I'd have to say that the Saunders fight seems a little bit more doable, a little bit more realistic than the Caleb Plant fight, it being that he already went to Caleb Plant 2 times under 2 separate sets of circumstances, and neither of those times did the fight get made, whereas Canelo just did business with Matchroom against a Matchroom fighter, and Billy Joe Saunders is yet another Matchroom fighter that has something that Canelo Alvarez wants. Now, if Canelo Alvarez so decides to take on Billy Joe Saunders 1 fight from now or 2 fights from now, that begs the question as to what exactly is Caleb Plant going to be doing in the mean in-between time to raise his marquee value. Is he yet another fighter that's going to sit on his hands, play it safe, and rely on Canelo to be the driving force of revenue? Reference to Errol Spence Jr., this is what I told you guys before the outcome of the fight was even determined, before Canelo even beat Callum Smith, that, Canelo's entertaining a lot of different ideas right now, throwing those ideas around, but ultimately, he's not set to go back down to 160 pounds in the near future. And if he is to spend the next 12 months attempting to unify the super middleweight division, in a year from now, or over a year from now, do you think he's going to feel like making 160?
No.
And over a year from now, where will Errol Spence Jr. be in his career?
Assuming he doesn't retire in that time.
Do you guys see what that guy said? Via his social media, via his Twitter account, that he's here for a good time, but not a long one. Sounds to me like that's a fighter that's hinting at retirement in the near future. Otherwise, I can't explain why he would have said something like that. The bottom line here is that for all the talk that we've been seeing of a Canelo Alvarez versus Errol Spence Jr. fight, for all that talk, it's what I always told you. That's just a lot of talk. That fight ain't getting off the ground anytime in the near future, if at all. Granted, that's probably not going to stop Errol Spence Jr. from constantly name-dropping Canelo Alvarez in interviews to gain publicity and keep that conversation alive. It's not going to stop him from talking about Canelo, but the reality of it is Canelo's no excuse to put any other fight on the back burner, namely a Terrence Crawford fight. You can't say I can't fight Crawford because I'm going to fight Canelo when you're not going to fight Canelo.
Stop making excuses.
Canelo's interests lie at 168 pounds, not 160, and he can't be your crutch to continually put the Crawford fight on the back burner, even though we all know that that's what Errol's going to do. I mean, that's what he's going to do. Another news per tweet from Michael Benson. Tyson Fiore and Teofimo Lopez have been announced as joint winners of the 2020 Ring Magazine Fighter of the Year award. Fiore dethroned Deontay Wilder back in February, and Lopez conquered Vasyl Lomachenko in October. Comparatively, I'd have to say that Teofimo Lopez's win over Vasyl Lomachenko is arguably a bigger win than Tyson Fury's win over Deontay Wilder. Tyson Fury's win over Deontay Wilder was more emphatic than Teofimo's, but comparatively, Deontay Wilder was not to the heavyweight division what Vasyl Lomachenko was to the lightweight division and to the sport of boxing. You gotta remember, a lot of guys looked at Vasyl Lomachenko as being all but invincible. He was favored to beat Teofimo Lopez. Teofimo was the underdog going into that fight. And Teofimo won in a fashion that most didn't expect, as there were people out there who thought that Teofimo could possibly win the fight, but win the fight by way of knockout early. Nobody really imagined that he could win on the cards, win a decision, win on points against Vasyl Lomachenko. That's what he did.
The Lomachenko win is a bigger win in my book.
Teofimo Lopez effectively procured the WBO, the WBA, and the Ring Magazine titles, becoming a unified champion in the process of beating Vasyl Lomachenko. He's undisputed to some, but not to others, and at minimum, what we can say is that he effectively became a unified champion in one fell swoop in a fight that he was favored
to lose.
Whereas with Tyson Fury, that was a great victory over Deontay Wilder. It was, and it was dramatic, it was emphatic, but a lot of people already felt that Fury got the best of Wilder in the first fight, that, those two knockdowns that Wilder scored, great knockdowns that they might have been, that wasn't enough, at least to some, to say that it was a draw or to say that, Wilder won the fight or whatever. A lot of people already thought that Fury beat Wilder, whereas with Teofimo Lopez, big question marks over that fight, big question marks over Teofimo Lopez. Does he belong? And he answered those questions. So, as far as I'm concerned, Teofimo Lopez's win was the bigger win. If I had it my way, I would have given it to Teofimo exclusively as the 2020 Fighter of the Year. Look at how many people tuned in to see that fight. That was the most watched fight in this country.
What was it, 4.2 million?
Those are very big numbers in today's boxing climate, boxing landscape in this part of the world. I mean, the fans really showed up in the viewership, even if they could not be in attendance. It's a great pity that the fight wasn't staged in front of a live audience. Better still, I think Teofimo's win comparatively is a bigger win than Fury's over Wilder, but that's just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree. And finally, per yet another tweet from Michael Benson, Billy Joe Saunders on Anthony Joshua's post-fight interview, just because you don't talk about it doesn't mean you don't want it. That's a lot of money to say a man don't want. I take that with a pinch of salt. I'm sure that he's just as eager to make it as Tyson Fury. I think that Billy is exhibiting sound logic. He's echoing some of the sentiments here expressed on the channel, that just because Anthony Joshua doesn't react the way that everybody wants him to react, he doesn't say something the same way somebody wants him to say something, that doesn't communicate apprehensiveness. That doesn't mean that he's trying to circumvent the Tyson Fury fight. These criticisms that were levied towards Anthony Joshua's verbiage post-fight likely coming from the same people who thought that he didn't want the Wilder fight. And that turned out to be false. According to Wilder, the Joshua people put up more money for him to fight Joshua than was on the table for him to fight Fury. So, they were wrong about that. These criticisms were also likely coming from the same people that thought that, Anthony Joshua was finished after the first Andy Ruiz fight. That how could he bounce back from that? He'll never recover. He'll likely lose the second fight the same way he lost the first fight. And, they turned out to be wrong about that as well. So here today, in light of the critics once again taking aim at Anthony Joshua for semantics of all things,
Give me a break.
They're likely wrong about that as well. And it goes back to what I told you before. I think what they're mad at is that he didn't put special emphasis on who was holding the belt, the green belt, so much as that's what he's after. He wants to become the heavyweight division's undisputed champion. When Wilder had the belt, he's going after that guy. Now that Fury's got it, he's going after him. But it is the belt that he's after. It's not so much about Fury, but Joshua's already existing goal of unifying all the titles. I guess that, they wanted him to drive up to Fury's house, knock on his door, and pee on his porch.
You can't do that.
They want some kind of over-the-top call-out from Joshua to Fury. The kind of WWE antics that we see from Tyson Fury, who's actually been on the WWE. Better still, this is just the latest attempt to attack Anthony Joshua's character. That's all it is. And ultimately, I'm in agreement with Billy Joe Saunders. I think that Anthony Joshua wants to fight. For what it's worth, I think Tyson Fury does too, and it's because of the financial incentive. If nothing else, the financial incentive has got to make the fight appealing to both parties. You're not going to make the money fighting anybody else that you're going to make fighting each other. That's the truth of it. And even if Anthony Joshua is the A-side, the bigger marquee attraction globally than Tyson Fury is, it's a fight that they both want.
No need for the character assassinations.
We'll say that in observing the current climate, the landscape, and what's going on, I don't see Anthony Joshua having the adverse reaction to Tyson Fury's taunts, call-outs, and mind games that other fighters have had. He effectively got into Vladimir Klitschko's head. I think he effectively got into Deontay Wilder's head as well. Anthony Joshua does seem to be a little different.
He's still in character.
Don't see any changes in his demeanor. Anything that I could interpret as apprehensiveness or cold feet, shrinking on the precipice of what could very well be the biggest fight of his career. I don't see any signs of that. For what it's worth, Anthony Joshua seems well equipped to deal with Tyson Fury's unique brand of banter. Try as he might, I don't really see Tyson Fury getting into Anthony Joshua's head the way he has in the past with other fighters. An encouraging sign for anyone banking on Joshua for the win, though in truth, it's anybody's guess who's going to win this fight if and when it goes down.